1, 0.
The little airfield was busy on the morning of December 7th, 1941. A Hawaiian Airlines DC-3 was being prepped for a flight to Maui, and an Aeronca 65TC tandem carrying a local lawyer, Roy Vidisuk, and his teenage son Martin, had already taken off for a sightseeing trip. At the KT Flying Service hangar, 3 small aircraft were taxiing out to the airfield's 1,000-foot-long runway, their student pilots and instructors hoping to get airborne before the morning winds kicked up along Oahu's south coast. One after the other, the little airplanes lifted into the sky and headed off on their various flights. 2 men, 20-year-old Army National Guard Sergeant Henry Blackwell and 21-year-old Corporal Clyde Brown, had rented 2 Piper Cubs in order to take an early morning sightseeing flight. Along with them, they brought a friend, 21-year-old Sergeant Warren Rasmussen. 38-year-old Bob Tice, a part owner of KT Aviation, and his wife Edna were leaving their Honolulu home for the airport as to be on hand when Blackwell and Brown returned. Bob had taught Blackwell and Brown to fly, and they had become friends, and the Tices simply wanted to say their farewells. In less than an hour, the GIs would become the first American military personnel killed during the Japanese attack on Oahu, and Bob Tice would be the assault's first civilian victim. This is believed to be how the attacks unfolded. At the time of the attacks, 5 civilian aircraft were airborne. Blackwell, Brown, and Rasmussen were in the air at about 500 feet off the coast from Fort Weaver, a coastal artillery post on the west bank of the entrance to the channel. 27-year-old Marguerite Gambo, a flight instructor, was southwest of Kaneohe Bay with a student. Cornelia Fort, a 22-year-old flight instructor from Nashville, was in the traffic pattern at Rogers Field with a student in an Interstate S1. Roy Vidisuk and his son had returned from their sightseeing flight and were also in the traffic pattern at Rogers Field. Some 30 miles to the north, Tommy Tomberlin and a student, James Duncan, had just rounded Kahuku Point, Oahu's most northerly headland. They were flying just on shore in a bright orange Aeronca that the club had rented from Marguerite Gambo's flying service, and were headed southwest at about 1,000 feet towards Laie. Tomberlin was the first of the civilian pilots to realize that war had come to Hawaii. At 7:52 a.m., as noted in his logbook, he and Duncan were just north of the Mormon Temple in Laie when 2 streams of red tracers, probably from a Japanese Zero's 20mm cannons, converged on the Aeronca from behind. The ordnance punched fist-sized holes in the fabric covering the rear fuselage of the vertical stabilizer and sheared 2 longerons. Tomberlin, in the rear seat, instinctively took controls of the aircraft and snapped it into a descending left bank toward the sea, jinking as the plane lost altitude. Over the next 3 minutes, 2 Japanese aircraft, most likely Zero fighters, from an 11-plane flight tasked with strafing Kaneohe Naval Air Station, fired at the Aeronca, though they scored no additional hits. Knowing that they had more important targets, they left the Aeronca alone and went on to attack military targets. Tomberlin kept the Aeronca just above the waves, headed southeast, intending to sneak through the Pali Pass through the Ko'olau Range on the way back to Rogers Field. Already approaching the Pali Pass from the southeast were Gambo and her student. As the Japanese fighters pulled up from their first strafing and attack runs on Kaneohe, the Aeronca was buffeted by turbulence caused by the passing Japanese combat aircraft. Though Gambo initially thought they were Army aircraft, a quick glance at the smoke plumes rising over Kaneohe convinced her that they were in fact enemy planes. The Japanese planes flew past her without firing a shot, and Gambo turned toward the Pali Pass and raced for the airport. Japanese aircraft had begun attacking Hickam Field just to the northwest of the civilian airport at 7:55, and the sky around John Rogers was filled with Zeros, Valdai bombers, and Nakajima horizontal bombers, either strafing or pulling off their attack runs. Approaching the civilian field at about 800 feet and concentrating on lining up for landing was Roy Vidisuk. Vidisuk was oblivious to the hostile aircraft below and just to the north of the Aeronca until his son Martin called out, "Look, P-40s!" Roy snapped his head up to see the huge red insignia on the side of one of the nearby aircraft and shouted back, "P-40s, hell, they're Japanese!" The elder Vidisuk pulled the tandem into a steep climb and turned south out to the sea. The rear gunners in two of the passing aircraft fired at the Aeronика but did no damage, and Vidisek circled offshore until he saw a chance to slip into John Rogers Field. At roughly the same time as the Vidiseks became aware of the Japanese planes, Cornelia Fort and her student were approaching the airfield from the southeast around 200 feet, about to turn on the base leg of the traffic pattern. Fort looked to her left, out to sea, to ensure the cadet was clear to make the turn, and then saw a military plane headed toward shore at a higher altitude. Noting that it would clear the cadet by several hundred feet, she leaned forward to tell her student to begin the turn, and then saw another military aircraft headed directly for the cadet on a collision course. Fort grabbed the controls and pulled up, jarring the throttle open. She was annoyed at what she assumed was a hot-dogging Army pilot, until she glanced at the aircraft and saw the Japanese insignia on the side. She then looked at Pearl Harbor and saw the smoke billowing into the sky. Realizing what she would later write as, "The air was not the place for our little baby airplane," Fort put the cadet on the ground as quickly as she could and taxied to the Andrew Flying Service hangar. Bullets from strafing aircraft kicked dust up in front of her. She and her student jumped from the aircraft and sprinted toward the Andrews office. Bob Tice, the co-owner of KT Flying Service, and his wife Edna had just arrived at the hangar about 7:50. They walked out on the ramp shortly thereafter to stand in the sun. Almost immediately, he turned and shouted for Edna, who was in the office, to join him. As she walked out, Bob pointed to pillars of smoke boiling into the sky to the west and said, "I think Hickam Field is having some kind of an accident." The couple could hear the thump, thump, thump of explosions and wondered if there had been a fire at the base's ammunition dump. While Bob and Edna stood staring at the smoke, they noticed an airplane approaching from the direction of Hickam, flying low and fast. As the plane sped toward them, Edna said, "They're flying too low over a civilian airport." She looked at her watch, noting the time was exactly 7:55. The mysterious aircraft roared past so low that Edna clearly saw the two crew members. The plane zoomed out over the ocean, turned steeply, and came back towards the KT hangar. As the Japanese pilot opened fire, just missing Cornelia Fort's taxiing cadet, Bob turned to say something to Edna, and a bullet hit him in the back of the head. He dropped to the ground, and his wife, unhurt despite the fact that she had been standing right next to him, reacted as the nurse she had once been, checking Bob's pulse, though intuitively she knew that he was already gone. Arriving in Andrew's office, Cornelia Fort shouted, "The Japs are attacking." Her comment was initially met with disbelieving laughter, but the laughing suddenly stopped when a mechanic ran in and shouted that a strafing plane had just killed Bob Tice. Across the field, the ground workers of Hawaiian Airlines quickly realized what was going on and deplaned the passengers on their DC-3 flight to Maui. Moments later, the DC-3 was strafed and dozens of bullets ripped through both the cockpit and the passenger cabin. Fortunately, the passengers and crew were unhurt as they had returned to the terminal. It was almost an hour later when Edna realized that the two Piper Cubs rented by the young soldiers had not yet returned. The best witness for what happened to the two Piper Cubs with Brown, Blackwell, and Rasmussen is Navy machinist mate First Class Norman B. Repue, a 41-year-old sailor assigned to a 65-foot motor tugboat. Repue's account of the event states that at 7:55, his boat was underway for the Pearl Harbor entrance about 400 yards south of the channel buoy number 4, when the crew saw explosions engulfing Hickam Field. Repue saw the bright yellow Cubs ahead of the tug offshore. Repue would tell the Star Bulletin newspaper they didn't have a chance. Both were cruising about 2.5 miles offshore at about 500 feet when 7 Japanese planes swooped down. One of the yellow civilian planes plummeted straight down in the ocean. The other circled for a moment and then plunged. It floated there for a while before sinking. Though an Army crash rescue boat sortied from Pearl Harbor within 30 minutes of the incident, its crew found no trace of the Cubs or their occupants. 11 days later, on the morning of December 18th, a Honolulu dentist, Dr. Dae-Yin Chang, was walking on the beach just west of the entrance to Pearl Harbor when he found a large piece of what appeared to be a section of the airplane's outer wing panel. The Civilian Aeronautics Authority inspector positively identified the wreckage as coming from one of the KT Cubs. Brown, Blackwell, and Rasmussen were officially listed as missing in action, body not recovered. On the afternoon of December 31st, 1941, soldiers on a work detail at Fort Kamehameha made a macabre discovery. Washed up on the beach was a brown Army service shoe containing a badly decomposed human foot encased in a waterlogged Army sock. Although not conclusive, it is believed to have been that of Sergeant Henry C. Blackwell, flying one of the Piper Cubs. Bob Tice's widow, Edna, remarried in 1942 to Robert Q. Palmer, a sailor based at Pearl Harbor. They settled in Northern California, where Edna died in July 2000 at the age of 89. Cornelia Fort would die in a midair collision on March 21, 1943. The footstone of her grave is inscribed, "Killed in the service of her country." She was 24 years old. Marguerite Gambo would make her small aviation service available to the needs of the military during the war.